This is Exit Strategy Podcast, a podcast about geopolitics, conflict, and the illicit political economy. Today we speak to William Davison, a security and conflict analyst with the International Crisis Group. He provides a background and summary of the events that led up to the current Tigray War, a conflict occurring in the north of Ethiopia. We speak about the events that led up to that war, what's happening on the ground, the human rights abuses that have occurred there, and what's to come for Ethiopia. You can follow us on Instagram at exitstrategy.podcast, Twitter at exitstratpod, and all available syndicated podcast platforms. Thank you for listening. Will Davison, thank you so much for joining the podcast this morning. You are an analyst with the Crisis Group based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I wanted to discuss with you the latest happenings on the ground in Ethiopia. The country is just coming out of a very brutal conflict in the Tigray region. It's just had federal elections. Before we get into the conversation, can you provide some sort of some historical context, some basis for our listeners to understand what led up to the Tigray conflict and kind of where Ethiopia is now?
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much for having me. And then, second, I'm not currently based in Addis, unfortunately. I haven't been based there since November, actually, which is when the war broke out. But there's different ways of looking at the build up and the background to the conflict. We have a sort of increasingly bitter political dispute since 2018, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took power, and that sort of took the form of an electoral constitutional dispute. But really, it was about the the leaders of Tigray region, who during the previous couple of decades had been an important part of a ruling coalition. So an important part of the federal government. They really lost a lot of power in 2018, and so it was the fallout of that which led to the war, and we can go into detail on that, obviously. The broader background is that, certainly part of the issue here that sort of shrouds that electoral constitutional dispute is about the right to self-rule and self-determination within Ethiopia for ethnic groups or for nations, as some of the groups see themselves, and therefore a struggle about the degree of autonomy that regional states have within the Ethiopian system or within the federation. That's very relevant to this dispute that led to the war, but is also a dispute, an issue that has been prominent, certainly very much over the last 4 or 5 decades of Ethiopian politics, with first national liberation struggles essentially for the different communities in Ethiopia sort of first emerging in the 1970s after the downfall of an imperial regime. And they sort of picked up pace, including very much the struggle by the Tigray People's Liberation Front. They picked up pace in the 1980s, led to the downfall of a military regime in 1991. And then it was in the ashes of that military regime that this federation was constructed. And on paper, that federation grants regional states such as Tigray a huge amount of autonomy. And many of those regional states have a strong sort of ethnic or national character to them. In that the dominant group is, for example, the Oromo in Oromia, the Amhara in Amhara, and indeed Tigrayans in Tigray. And so it's that sort of historic struggle between a sort of centralizing national Ethiopian identity and then the political rights of the communities that comprise Ethiopia, which is the sort of longer background to this conflict.
Right. What were the things that actually led up to guns being fired? What actually started the actual conflict?
Well, working backwards, what happened is that the sort of first shot really was an attempt by Tigray's regional government to sort of neutralize a federal military command that was stationed in Tigray. And Tigray's leaders said that was because the federal military was about to intervene to remove Tigray's government. And so obviously you can imagine once Tigray's leadership took the decision to try and neutralize a section of the federal military, the response was indeed a full-scale federal military intervention.
And was that military intervention on behalf of the Ethiopian government? Did they want to intervene to remove or dismantle the Tigray autonomous region? Why did they want to do that? Were they using COVID-19 as the backdrop for this operation?
COVID-19 comes into it, but just working back from that, the issue that led to a very serious constitutional dispute, and it led to the federal government classifying Tigray's government as illegitimate and unconstitutional, and vice versa. That indeed was an election delay due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The delay led to a decision by federal authorities to extend all government terms, including Tigray regional governments, past their constitutional deadline. And as part of a political dispute and rivalry, really, partly, Tigray's government said that was unacceptable. Right. And they said, we do not accept federal authority. We're going to go ahead and run our own regional election. And it was when Tigray's government autonomously ran their regional election, the federal government said that they were not allowed to do that. And that led to increasingly sort of risky, provocative maneuvering by both sides, including over this federal military command stationed in the region, and it was that which led to the outbreak of war.
Right. There have been reports in the news that Eritrea is the country that borders Ethiopia to its north. Abiy Ahmed was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering a peace deal with them years ago. How does Eritrea play into this? Who are all of the actors that were at play during this conflict?
Yeah, Eritrea's leadership is a historic enemy of Tigray's leadership. They were actually rebel comrades in the 1980s, but then Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia in the 1990s, and relations really nosedived with those Tigrayan leaders who were prominent nationally. That led to a border war, a war in 1998 between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and a further worsening of relations between Tigray and Eritrean elites. So when this federal intervention occurred in Tigray, the Eritrean military entered the war as an ally of the federal government, and that was seen partly as an attempt to exact revenge upon the TPLF leadership, TPLF being the ruling party of Tigray, by Eritrea. So Eritrea has been prominently involved in the war. They also seem to have conducted themselves very badly. Widespread looting, sexual violence against the Tigrayan population, as well as arbitrary killings of civilians. And the other major contingent has been Amhara regional forces from Ethiopia. That's significant for a number of reasons, but the main one is that as part of this federal intervention, Amhara regional state made good on some territorial claims against Tigray. They said that areas that were part of Tigray should never have been made so, and they essentially took these areas back during the conflict.
Right, and so can you provide some background to what led up to the ceasefire? Where are we at now on the ground between the Tigrayan forces? I know they took back the capital city a few weeks ago, or about a week ago. What's it like there now?
Well, the federal government suffered some major battlefield reversals in June against what has become known as the Tigray Defense Forces, who are fighting for the rights of Tigray's government and people as they see it. That led to a wholesale federal withdrawal from Tigray. So the withdrawal of almost all federal troops, as well as the interim administrators that Addis Ababa had appointed. So a huge reversal for Abiy Ahmed and his government, as well as their allies. It was only subsequent to that that the federal government offered a ceasefire, but that was never going to be accepted by the Tigrayan leadership. And that's because of that Amhara occupation of parts of Tigray. Accepting the ceasefire would mean accepting Amhara control of areas that the Tigrayans consider to be part of Tigray.
Right.
So instead, now the focus of the fighting is on the Tigray Defense Forces trying to reclaim those areas that Amhara regional state, in its eyes, has just reclaimed from Tigray.
And so now there have been federal elections. Mr. Ahmed has been reelected by a landslide. What do you see around this? What are the implications of this election? And what are the concerns that you have now for the state of this conflict going forward?
I think what it means is that, as has been the case for a while, that there is very mixed fortunes for the Prime Minister. Obviously, that puts him in quite a strong support domestically in some regards. This overwhelming majority for his Prosperity Party. And we should say that the Prosperity Party was created in 2019, and actually, the TPLF, which was part of the former ruling coalition, it said it would not join Abiy's Prosperity Party, saying that its structure. But going back, yes, a strengthened position because of this election win. But really, the recent developments in Tigray show that the federal efforts to essentially to pacify Tigray and remove the current leadership have been an almost complete failure, and it's led to serious damage to the federal military, as well potentially to the political standing of the Prime Minister and his government. Now, that hasn't really filtered through yet into any major impact on the Prime Minister's authority, but there is a concern that, for example, if the Tigray Defense Forces are successful in removing the Amhara regional forces, particularly from Western Tigray, well, that could lead to quite a lot of anger from the Amhara directed not just against the Tigrayans, but also against the federal government, which will have been seen and perceived as having failed to support the Amhara territorial claims. So that could be increasingly destabilizing for the country. And the other important thing here is the international dimension, because of the concerns about very, very serious human rights abuses committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces in Tigray, as well as the concerns about spreading famine conditions. There is a huge amount of international pressure on Addis Ababa here, unless people find a way out of this conflict and a sort of return or some effort to launch a process of political reconciliation, then it's likely that international pressure will grow.
Yes, I just saw World Food Program trucks finally able to get into Mekelle recently. On Twitter, I saw some video there. What can you say about the human rights abuses? What were the reports saying during this conflict? Are they still ongoing? What's happening on that front?
They're not really ongoing to the same scale because we have very different conditions now.
Sure.
The federal soldiers have withdrawn. A lot of the Tigrayans who were living in Western Tigray have left, and then the Eritrean military has also retreated to northern areas of Tigray and Ethiopia and Eritrea around the disputed international border. But there was many allegations of, like I said, widespread looting, sexual violence, killings of civilians committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers, and also allegations of very violent depopulation of Tigrayans, coercive depopulation of Tigrayans in the west of Tigray, and also some allegations against Tigrayan militia, including the killing of Amhara civilians at the outset of the war, and some allegations of violence against Eritrean refugees who were residing in camps in Tigray as well.
A curious question, and I understand if maybe you don't have much on this, but I always tend to ask, because I know you've given a lot of interviews and you've provided some great background and analysis as you have today. Do you find that there is anything in especially Western media or international media that has kind of gotten wrong about this, or what maybe they're missing? Is there some critical element of the reporting of this conflict that you have found was deeply lacking?
I think everyone was struggling to get the narrative were to get the facts correct, because there was pretty much a total blockade on Tigray in the first 2 months of the war by the federal government, meaning that it was very hard to get information out of the region. So, for example, it took a long time for people to be clear that Eritrea's military was involved in the conflict. That took until about December, so at least a month really after Eritrea's entry. So that was a very slow process, and essentially meant that the international coverage missed a huge component of the war. But it was hard for myself and the crisis group to be authoritative about it because of the lack of information. I think certain aspects of the narrative that people ends up being a bit misleading. I mean, I think it's very clear that Tigray's government moved to neutralize that federal military command because they feared imminent federal intervention. But I'd been following the build-up for months, and at Crisis Group we'd released reports, including one 3 days before the outbreak of war, saying that war was imminent unless the parties changed course. So really, there was a much clearer and longer build-up to the war. There's a sort of impression given that the Tigrayans sort of randomly attack a federal military base and kick the war off. I mean, that wasn't the case at all. So there's aspects of the narrative like that which maybe have been a bit misleading at times. I think people from the government and those who are very supportive of the war against the TPLF, they will often say that the TPLF's period in power over the previous few decades is not understood fully by the international community. But really, from my perspective, even those who understand the recent history of Ethiopia, they still consider the conduct of the war, aspects of the conduct of the war, and the ultimate objective to be either unconscionable or completely misguided from the federal government side. And so even people who do understand the context of the TPLF time in power, that doesn't really justify this war.
Sure. Yes, I know the New York Times journalist Simon Marks was asked to leave the country, had his J-1 visa revoked when he was reporting on the human rights abuses during this war. Did you come into any issues with the government on that, or with your work with the crisis group?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was deported on November the 21st, and it was officially due to a work permit irregularity. But I think it was related to being very prominent in terms of commenting on the build-up to the war, criticizing the war, saying that the TPLF, regardless of their track record, they had a lot of support in Tigray, that it would be very hard for the federal government to achieve its objectives without devastating Tigray and its civilian population, and that ultimately the war was misguided, and that all parties should have taken steps to avoid war. And I think that commentary, which people in Addis simply did not want to hear, but has proved fairly accurate. I think that contributed to the deportation.
Fascinating. Yeah. Do you know what's to come with that? I mean, will the Ethiopian government allow journalists back in? Will they allow the crisis group to continue work there?
I don't think there's sort of definitive answers. I think that the government obviously has obligations, and it realizes that the press is necessary for various reasons, and parts of the government understand the value of the media. But at the same time, we've just got into one of those situations where the positions have become so polarized and extreme, that the people who are critical of the war, as we were at Crisis Group, or people who are reporting on government human rights abuses, they get accused of being agents of the TPLF and this type of thing.
Right.
And that's what's happening by a few random people on social media. This is coming from official sources and outlets. So things have just become very extreme, and it creates an atmosphere of overall official intolerance, which obviously led to Simon's deportation, my deportation, made life very difficult for others. So it's just a difficult time. And I think once Ethiopia's able to ease some of these political disputes, hopefully, then it will become a more permissive environment for analysts and reporters and whoever. But I mean, I think the other thing we should always state here is, yes, the work of the New York Times and Crisis Group is important, but what Ethiopia really needs is for Ethiopian researchers and journalists to be given the freedom to do their work in Ethiopia, and they need to have powerful institutions that they're working for, which can really shine a light and help to shape the conversation in Ethiopia, because that's what the country And that's one of the things that the country is most starkly lacking, and it really contributes to to some of the disastrous, violent political events we're seeing.
Right. Where is the best? What is the best resource in your mind for people to follow developing events in Ethiopia? And maybe what are some other either Ethiopian, if they exist, organizations, or even international organizations such as the Crisis Group? Are there other ones that are actively involved in researching and covering the security situation in the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia?
I mean, there's a bit of a shortage of regular coverage from Ethiopian NGOs and human rights groups, but I mean, I think for English readers, I think Addis Standard website does a very good job of covering the news with some analysis. I actually founded a website called Ethiopia Insight in 2018. We provide quite a lot of valued, more analytical coverage, mostly of the situation. So I think those are two media outlets that I would refer to. I mean, I think maybe the usual suspects in terms of big human rights reports are always useful, meaning Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, although obviously, as with many places, there's plenty of contestation about their findings.
Sure, certainly. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us on? I know we are about at time. I'm so thankful for you to give time and provide some background and analysis on what's happening there today. It's certainly valuable for our listeners, but happy for you to provide your social media or anything else you'd like to say at the end of this hour.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably quite a confusing picture for people. So I think the only way to kind of get a better understanding is to read a bit more. But what I would say is that Ethiopia does have has had very kind of authoritarian political systems, and that's definitely part of the problem. And the TPLF was certainly partly responsible for that. But there's also these, political disputes, quite toxic political disputes. But there's also these big ideological questions about the makeup of the state and competing narratives about Ethiopian history. Again, polarized, whether this federal structure is a legitimate expression of articulation of sort of group rights, of collective rights, or whether it's some sort of like apartheid system which is driving Ethiopians apart. Now, because Ethiopia has got into the state it's in with underlying very difficult socioeconomic conditions, these very deep-rooted and ultimately now violent political differences. This is why organizations like Crisis Group and representatives of those organizations, including foreign governments, are saying, we need a reset here. That you can't keep going like this. Yes, people have. Yes, you can justify the various aspects of various positions on each side, but ultimately, this is just proving incredibly destructive. And we need a reset, and a reset to, amnesties, forgiveness, formal efforts at reconciliation. A continuation of sort of zero-sum politics, people taking power and using power to exclude their opponents. Is just going to lead to a continuation of quite a long cycle of violence. So it sort of sounds like boilerplate, obviously, when people talk about dialogue, especially in the context of when people are using warfare to settle their political differences. But I think it's just very important to recognize that without some fundamental effort to reset things, and this is likely to lead to further and possibly increasing violence in Ethiopia, which obviously would be bad news for everyone, but most of all, Ethiopians.
Thank you again. I really appreciate it. Did you want to share your social media or give people some resources where they can follow? I believe the media, the site you said you founded, and anything else?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can follow me at WDavison10 on Twitter, and that's pretty much steady and exclusive commentary on Ethiopia's political affairs, and then just search the Ethiopia Crisis Group for our publications there, and you can find the website I founded, Ethiopia Insight, pretty easily as well.
Fantastic. We'll follow for sure, and I'm happy to keep the conversation going, certainly as events continue to develop in that country. Will Davison, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time, and hope you have a good one. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye now.